In a world of GPS and paved highways, one man chose to disappear. He didn't use maps. He didn't follow signs. Instead, he spent years tracking the ghosts of the Old West, following nothing but the faded, dusty wagon tracks of the 1800s. People called him crazy until he stumbled upon something that wasn't supposed to exist.
The modern world is a loud place. It is a world of constant connection, of satellites whispering in our ears and glowing screens telling us exactly where we stand on a digital grid. But for me, that certainty felt like a cage. I didn't want to know where I was according to a satellite. I wanted to know where we had gone, where the soul of the land had retreated to when the pavement arrived. It started as a small itch, a quiet dissatisfaction with the hum of the highway. I found myself looking past the guardrails, beyond the neon signs of gas stations, into the vast, silent stretches of the American West. I began to wonder about the people who crossed this emptiness before there were maps to guide them. People who moved at the speed of a walking ox, whose lives depended on the depth of a river or the height of a mountain pass. They didn't have GPS. They had instinct, and they left behind something that the asphalt could never truly bury. I remember the day I left the pavement for good. I was standing on the edge of a high desert plateau in Nevada, the sun a pale, dying ember on the horizon. My truck was parked a mile back, its engine ticking as it cooled, a sound that felt violent in such a deep silence. I looked down at the GPS unit in my hand, watching the blue dot pulse steadily. It told me I was in the middle of nowhere, but my eyes told me something else. There, stretching out toward the purple shadows of the Great Basin, were two parallel depressions in the earth. They weren't roads. They weren't even trails anymore. They were scars, faint rhythmic indentations carved into the crust of the desert by the heavy timber wheels of thousands of wagons. The old Oregon Trail, the Mormon Trail, the nameless paths of the desperate and the brave. I knelt down and pressed my palm into the dirt of one of those ruts. The earth was cold, packed hard by a pressure that had been applied 150 years ago. It felt like touching a pulse that had stopped but was waiting to be found. In that moment, the digital world felt thin and fragile. The satellite signals passing through my body felt like static. The only thing that felt real was the dust under my fingernails and the long, winding memory of the pioneers. I realized then that I wasn't looking for a destination. I was looking for a connection. I wanted to see the world as they saw it, not as a series of coordinates, but as a living, breathing obstacle. I wanted to feel the anxiety of the water barrel running low and the relief of finding a single lonely spring in a canyon of red rock. People think the desert is empty, but it's crowded with the ghosts of the 1840s. As I followed those tracks deeper into the sagebrush, the modern world began to dissolve. The sound of the wind through the greasewood started to sound like the flapping of canvas wagon covers. The shifting of the sand sounded like the low moan of weary livestock. I left the GPS in the dirt. I didn't need it. The tracks were a language I was finally learning to read. These wagons hadn't just moved through the landscape, they had struggled against it. I saw where a wheel had slipped on a sharp incline, leaving a deep gouge in a limestone shelf that looked as fresh as if it had happened yesterday. I found a rusted iron square nail, handmade by a blacksmith in some forgotten town back east, dropped by a man whose name has been erased by time. These were the breadcrumbs of a lost civilization, and I was the only one left to follow them. The tracks led me away from the sun, toward a range of jagged mountains that didn't appear on my topographical charts. The air grew thin and tasted of ancient copper. My heart hammered against my ribs, not from fear, but from a strange, exhilarating sense of homecoming. I was walking into the blind spots of the map, into the places where the ink had run dry. As the first stars began to pierce the darkening sky, I reached the crest of a nameless ridge. Below me lay a valley shrouded in a thick, unnatural mist that seemed to glow with a pale silver light. The tracks didn't stop at the edge of the valley. They plummeted straight into the fog, deeper and more defined than they had been all day. I stood there for a long time listening to the silence of a place that time had forgotten. The tracks were leading me to a place that shouldn't exist on any map. But what I found in the next valley changed everything.
The mist in that valley felt less like weather and more like a curtain, a heavy silver veil separating the world of the living from the echoes of the dead. As I stepped down into the silence, the air grew cold enough to sharpen my breath, and the wagon tracks beneath my feet became so deep they felt like trenches carved by the weight of 1,000 sorrows. Walking these ruts is not like walking a trail, it is like walking a timeline. With every mile, the years seemed to strip away. The deeper I went, the more the modern world felt like a dream I had once had, a feverish hallucination of steel and glass that had no place here. In this valley, the 1840s weren't a chapter in a history book, they were the atmosphere. I found myself slowing my pace to match the rhythm of an ox. I began to see them, not with my eyes, but with a strange, heavy clarity in my chest. I saw the women in sun-bleached bonnets, their faces etched with a layer of dust that no water could ever truly wash away. I saw the men with hands like cracked leather, gripping the wooden spokes of wheels that were screaming for grease. I could almost hear it, the low, constant groan of timber under tension, the rhythmic thud of heavy hooves, and the dry, metallic clinking of chains. I stopped near a cluster of jagged rocks where the tracks swerved sharply. There, half buried in the alkaline crust, was a horseshoe, but it wasn't like the ones you see today. It was small, worn thin by hundreds of miles of brutal terrain, and twisted as if it had been ripped from the hoof in a moment of panic. I picked it up, and the weight of it felt immense. This wasn't just iron, it was a testament to a breaking point. Somewhere, a mile or maybe 10 miles from this spot, a horse had gone lame. A family looked at the horizon, realized they were falling behind the train, and felt the first cold finger of terror touch their spines. A few yards further, I found a square-cut iron nail and a shard of thick green glass from a medicinal bottle. I sat on a rock and held them in my hand, letting the desert wind whistle through the gaps in my fingers. I started to wonder about the woman who owned that bottle. Was it her only comfort against the mountain fever? Did she drop it when the wagon jolted over this very stone, watching her last bit of hope shatter into the dust? In the silence of the desert, you realize that history isn't made of great battles or famous speeches. It's made of these things: broken nails, thrown shoes, shattered glass. It's made of the quiet desperation of a father deciding which family heirloom to throw overboard to lighten the load so the oxen wouldn't collapse. I looked around the valley and saw the invisible debris of 1,000 such decisions. The hillsides were a graveyard of discarded furniture, broken axles, and dreams that grew too heavy to carry. The tracks began to feel crowded. I felt the presence of children running alongside the wagons, their laughter long since turned to dust. I felt the exhaustion of the old who knew they were walking toward a sunset they would never see. The trail wasn't just a path to the west, it was a living, breathing creature that demanded a sacrifice from everyone who stepped onto it. It demanded their sweat, their livestock, and often their very lives. I found a spot where the earth was scorched, a dark circle that had resisted the regrowth of the desert scrub for over a century, a campfire. I knelt and ran my fingers through the dirt, finding a tiny charred fragment of a wooden crate. I imagined them huddled here, the firelight flickering against the canvas covers, the vast American darkness pressing in from all sides. They must have been so small, a tiny circle of light in a wilderness that didn't know their names and didn't care if they survived the night. They spoke of Oregon, of California, of gold and green pastures, but their eyes were always on the tracks behind them, measuring the distance they had stolen from the void. The further I walked, the more I realized that I wasn't just a spectator. By following these tracks, I was keeping the road alive. As long as someone remembers the weight of the wagon, the road doesn't die. But the tracks were changing now. They were no longer the steady, purposeful lines of a migration. They were erratic. They were digging deep into the soft earth of the valley floor, crisscrossing in a way that suggested confusion or fear.
The sun began to disappear behind the western peaks, casting a blood-red light across the valley floor. The shadows of the sagebrush stretched out like long, reaching fingers. I followed the ruts toward the base of a sheer cliff where the trail seemed to narrow into a bottleneck. The echoes were louder here, the sound of a sudden, sharp command, the neighing of a frightened horse, the frantic scraping of wood against stone. I reached the mouth of a narrow canyon where the tracks abruptly vanished into a wall of thick, shifting sand. But as I leaned in closer, I saw a flicker of something metallic wedged deep in a crevice of the rock. A heavy iron linchpin, the kind used to hold a massive wagon wheel in place. It hadn't fallen. It had been driven into the rock with incredible force. I looked up at the darkening sky and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert night. The tracks were leading me to a place that shouldn't exist on any map. But what he found in the next valley changed everything.
The iron linchpin remained cold against my thumb, a heavy rusted anchor to a past that was becoming more real than the ground beneath my boots. As I left the mouth of that narrow canyon, the echoes of the 1840s followed me like a scent on the wind, a lingering reminder that every step I took was a step further into a story that had never been finished. I climbed out of the rocky bottleneck and found myself standing on a vast, windswept plateau that the locals called the High Empty. Before me, the horizon stretched out in an unbroken line of gray-green sage and sun-bleached earth. But as I looked down at the trail I had been following, my heart skipped a beat. The single, purposeful set of wagon ruts I had tracked across the desert didn't just continue, they fractured. At a point marked by nothing but a solitary, lightning-scarred juniper tree, the road split into 3 distinct directions. I pulled out my modern topographical map, the one that claimed to be the final word on this geography. I smoothed the paper against my knee, my eyes tracing the contours in the shaded relief. According to the ink in the satellites, there was nothing here. No junctions, no historical markers, no documented cutoffs. According to the map, I was standing in a void. But the Earth told a different story. The Earth spoke in the language of scars, and it was telling me that a choice had been made here, a desperate, chaotic choice. The first set of tracks veered hard to the north, climbing toward the jagged, snow-dusted teeth of the mountains. They were deep, jagged ruts, suggesting wagons that were heavily loaded and moving with a frantic, uneven energy. The second path continued straight into the white-hot glare of the salt flats, a shimmering mirage of heat and death where nothing had grown for 1,000 years. But it was the third path that held my gaze. It turned sharply to the south, descending into a series of deep, red-walled canyons that the sun never seemed to fully reach. I stood there at the crossroads of nowhere, the wind whistling through the dry branches of the juniper tree like a warning. In the mid-1800s, a mistake at a junction like this wasn't just a delay, it was a death sentence. I imagined the wagon masters standing exactly where I was, their hats pulled low against the stinging dust, arguing over tethered journals and hearsay. One man would point to the mountains, whispering of water and timber. Another would point to the flats, dreaming of a shortcut that would shave a week off the journey. And perhaps a silent few looked toward the canyons, drawn by a path that seemed to offer shade but smelled of a trap. The silence of the plateau was heavy with the weight of that old indecision. I could almost see the phantom wagons idling, the oxen lowing in frustration, the children sitting on the tailboards, unaware that their lives depended on which way the lead horse's head was turned. I checked my compass, but the needle was still sluggish, dancing erratically as if the very minerals in the soil were trying to lead me astray. I had enough water for 2 days, maybe 3 if I was careful. My boots were holding together, but the soles were thinning. If I chose the wrong path, the path that led to a dead end or a dry well, I wouldn't just be lost. I would become part of the history I was trying to document. I would be another relic for some future traveler to find. The northern tracks looked the most traveled, the most logical, but as I knelt to examine them, I saw something that gave me pause. The ruts didn't go over the rocks, they were smashed into them. There were splinters of weathered oak embedded in the stone, and stains of old axle grease that had turned into a black, obsidian-like crust. This wasn't a road of progress, it was a road of wreckage.
I turned my back on the mountains and the salt flats. Something about the southern tracks, the ones heading into the shadows of the red rock, felt different. They were narrower, the wheels spaced closer together. They didn't look like the tracks of a massive migration. They looked like the tracks of a single group, perhaps a single family, moving with a terrifying singular purpose. They weren't looking for a shortcut. They were looking for a hiding place. As I took my first step onto that southern trail, the ground seemed to give way beneath me, the soft sand swallowing my boots. The transition was immediate. The wide open sky of the plateau was suddenly cut off by the rising walls of the canyon. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in the matter of seconds. The light turned a bruised, dusty purple. The challenge was no longer just about navigation, it was about the terrain. The path grew steep and treacherous, the wagon ruts turning into narrow ledges barely wide enough for a man, let alone a team of oxen. I found myself sliding down embankments of loose shale, my hands raw from gripping the sharp edges of the canyon walls. I could see where the pioneers used ropes to lower their wagons down these inclines, deep, smooth grooves worn into the trunks of ancient stunted cedars where the hemp lines had burned through the bark. The sheer physical labor of it was staggering. I was carrying 40 pounds of gear. They were carrying their entire lives. I could feel their exhaustion in my own lungs, the phantom ache of shoulders strained against the wheel, the taste of copper and grit in the back of my throat. Every inch of forward motion was a battle won against gravity and despair. The canyon began to twist, turning back on itself in a dizzying labyrinth of stone. The tracks were harder to see now, obscured by the shifting shadows and the debris of flash floods. I found myself stopping every few yards, pressing my face to the rock, looking for a sign, any sign that I was still on the right path. I found it at the base of a towering monolith of sandstone. Carved into the rock, almost faded by 100 years of wind, were 3 initials, JMT, and a date, October 12, 1847. Beneath the date, a single word had been etched with a trembling hand: wait. I looked around the narrow floor of the canyon. There was no one to wait for. There was only the wind and the encroaching dark. I realized then that the tracks weren't just a trail anymore. They were a breadcrumb trail left by someone who knew they were heading into the unknown and was terrified of being forgotten. The sky above the canyon rim turned a deep obsidian black, and the stars appeared, not as friendly guides, but as cold, distant observers. I made camp in the lee of the monolith, my back against the carved initials. I didn't light a fire. I didn't want to disturb the shadows. The tracks were leading me to a place that shouldn't exist on any map, but what I found in the next valley changed everything. The carved command to wait seemed to vibrate against my spine as I huddled in the dark, a cold stone plea from a man who had been dust for over a century. That single word, etched in a moment of desperation, had transformed the canyon from a geological curiosity into a cathedral of ghosts. And as the last of the light bled out of the sky, I realized that I was no longer just a man following a trail. I was a guest in a house of shadows. The silence of the American West is not an absence of sound. It is a presence, a heavy, physical weight that presses against your eardrums until you begin to hear things that aren't there. Or perhaps you finally hear the things that always were. Out here, 100 miles from the nearest light bulb, the isolation begins to peel back the layers of your mind. You start to understand why the old-timers spoke of the mountain wimwams, and the tales of the indigenous tribes regarded certain stretches of this dirt as thin places, where the veil between the then and the now is worn to a thread. I didn't light a fire that night. I didn't want to be a beacon in a place that felt so private. I sat with my back against the sandstone monolith, watching the stars wheel overhead in a slow, indifferent dance. In the deep dark, my imagination began to play tricks with the wind. The gusts didn't just howl through the rock formations. They sighed. They whispered. They carried the faint, rhythmic creak of leather under strain and the distant, haunting lowing of cattle that had been dead for 10 generations. I found myself thinking about the folklore of these high deserts, the stories of the hollow men who follow travelers but never leave footprints, and the tales of the phantom train that isn't a train at all, but the collective memory of 1,000 lost wagons. We call them myths when we're sitting in our living rooms, but out here, under the cold gaze of an indifferent moon, the line between myth and memory dissolves. You realize that a place this vast doesn't just forget the suffering that happened upon it, it absorbs it, it keeps it. My mind drifted to the journals I had studied. I remembered the words of a young woman named Sarah, writing in 1849, who said the wind in the canyon sounded like her mother's voice calling her home to Ohio. She wrote that she would see figures standing on the ridges at twilight, figures that vanished when she rubbed her eyes. We call it cabin fever or exhaustion, but as I sat there, I saw a flicker of movement near the bend in the canyon. It was just a shadow, a shifting of the moonlight against the sagebrush, but for a heartbeat it looked like a man in a wide-brimmed hat leaning on a rifle, watching me with eyes that were older than the mountains. The isolation does something to your sense of self. You begin to feel small, not just in space, but in time. I looked at my modern gear, my high-tech boots and my synthetic jacket, and they felt like toys. They felt like insults to the spirits of the people who had come through here in wool and buckskin, carrying their lives in wooden boxes. I felt like an intruder, a voyeur looking into a grave that hadn't been properly closed. I closed my eyes, but the whispers didn't stop. They became more distinct. I heard the frantic, whispered prayers of a mother over a sick child. I heard the sharp, bitter arguments of men who had lost their way and were looking for someone to blame. I heard the quiet, rhythmic humming of a lullaby that had no melody, just a sorrowful, steady beat. It was as if the wind was playback tape, caught in a loop, replaying the emotional high watermarks of the trail. There is a specific kind of loneliness that only the American wilderness can provide. It's a loneliness that feels like a physical ache in the center of your chest. It's the realization that if you disappeared tonight, the desert wouldn't even blink. The wagon tracks would still be there, the stars would still turn, and the wind would continue its endless, rambling monologue. You are nothing to this land. You are a flicker of a candle in a hurricane. I found myself talking back to the shadows, just small things. I see you, I whispered into the dark. I'm just passing through. I'm here to remember. It sounds crazy when I say it now, but in that canyon, it felt like the only polite thing to do. The whispers seemed to soften after that. The air felt less like a threat and more like a conversation. I thought about the man who carved wait. Who was he waiting for? Did they ever arrive, or did he sit by his wagon until the thirst took him, watching the horizon until his eyes turned to glass? The tragedy of the trail isn't just the dying, it's the waiting. The waiting for rain, the waiting for the scouts to return, the waiting for a sign from a god that seemed to have stayed behind in the east. As the hours crawled towards dawn, the cold began to seep into my bones, a deep, prehistoric chill that no sleeping bag could ward off. I watched the shadows of the canyon walls shift and stretch, and for a moment I saw a line of silhouettes moving silently across the far rim. There was no sound of wheels, no clatter of hooves, just a slow, dignified procession of shapes cutting through the starlight. They moved with the heavy, slumped shoulders of the truly exhausted. They didn't look at me. They didn't look at anything. They were just moving west, forever trapped in the moment of their journey. I realized then that the traveler doesn't follow the tracks follow the traveler. They become inside you. They become the map of your own internal wilderness. By morning, I was no longer the man who left the truck. I was someone else, someone who understood that the past isn't behind us, it's underneath us. It's waiting for us to stop moving long enough so it can catch up. The first gray light of morning began to filter into the canyon, turning the red rock into the color of dried blood. The shadows retreated into the crevices, and the whispers died down into the low, constant moan of the desert. I packed my gear with trembling hands, my mind still echoing with the voices of the night. The trail was calling again, but it felt different now. It felt urgent. I followed the ruts that turned away from the monolith and toward a hidden gap in the canyon's floor, a passage that wasn't visible until you were standing right on top of it. The tracks were deeper here. The earth churned up as if the wagons had been forced through a narrow throat of stone. The tracks were leading me to a place that shouldn't exist on any map. But what he found in the next valley changed everything. The morning sun didn't chase away the shadows of the canyon. It merely exposed the brutality of the path ahead, revealing a vertical gauntlet of stone that looked less like a trail and more like a wound in the earth. The whispers of the night had faded, but they left a heavy residue in my mind, a lingering sense that I was being watched, not by eyes, but by the memory of the landscape itself. I stood at the base of what I came to call Dead Man's Pass. It wasn't marked on my topographic charts. According to the USGS data, this was just a solid wall of granite and shale. But the tracks, those stubborn, impossible tracks, said otherwise. They went straight up. I tilted my head back, tracing the faint, scratched line where iron rims had ground against bedrock, defying gravity, defying logic. It was a climb that would challenge a modern Jeep with a winch. The idea that families had dragged 1,000-pound wagons up this incline, with oxen heaving and ropes snapping, seemed physically impossible, yet the evidence was etched into the stone. The climb was slow and agonizing. My boots slipped on loose scree that had been waiting a century to slide. The air grew thinner, sharper, tasting of ozone and ancient dust. With every 100 feet of elevation, the silence deepened. It wasn't the peaceful silence of a library, it was the held-breath silence of an ambush. I found myself checking over my shoulder, half expecting to see a line of canvas-covered wagons struggling behind me, frozen in a sepia-toned purgatory. About halfway up, the trail narrowed to a terrifying ledge. To my left was a sheer drop into the canyon floor, 1,000 feet down where the shadows still pooled like dark water. To my right, the canyon wall rose straight up, unforgiving and cold. It was here on this precipice of nowhere that I saw it. At first, it looked like a pile of driftwood bleached bone white by the relentless high-altitude sun, but driftwood doesn't exist on a mountain peak. I scrambled closer, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The shape became clear, geometrical, unnatural. It was the skeleton of a wagon. It lay on its side, wedged into a fissure in the rock as if the mountain had tried to swallow it whole. The canvas cover was long gone, eaten by time and wind, leaving only the arched wooden bows reaching up like the ribs of a prehistoric beast picked clean by vultures. The heavy iron wheels were rusted into a deep blood-orange hue, fused to the axle by decades of oxidation. I approached it with a sense of reverence that bordered on fear. This wasn't just debris, this was a crime scene where the culprit was gravity and the victim was hope. I ran my hand along the splintered wood of the wagon tongue. It had snapped. I could see the violence of the break, the way the wood fibers were twisted. This hadn't been a gentle abandonment. The wagon had slipped, the oxen had lost their footing, or the ropes had failed. It had crashed here, shattering the spine of the journey. I crawled inside the wreckage, moving carefully to avoid the rusted nails that jutted out like jagged teeth. The floorboards were rotted through, revealing the dark crevice of rock beneath. It was empty of large cargo. Barrels, chests, and tools were likely scavenged or have fallen into the abyss below. But as I shifted a piece of debris near what used to be the driver's seat, I saw the glint of something that didn't belong to the Strone. It was a small metal tin, wedged tight between the iron bracing of the seat and the side panel. It was a biscuit tin, perhaps, or a tobacco box, painted a faded, chipping red. It had been protected from the direct sun and the worst of the rain by the angle of the wreckage. I worked it loose, the metal screeching in protest, a sound that tore through the silence like a scream. I sought back against the canyon wall, the tin heavy in my hands. The lid was rusted shut. I used my knife to carefully pry it open, the seal giving way with a snap. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had turned brittle and black, was a small leather-bound book. A journal. My hands trembled as I unwrapped it. The leather was dry and cracked, but the paper inside, the paper was still intact. I opened it to a random page. The handwriting was tight, jagged, scrawled in pencil by a hand that was likely shaking from exhaustion or fear. October 14th, 1847, the entry read. We have lost the Murphy wagon. The axle snapped on the rise. We could not save it. We could not save them. The guide, Mr. Holloway, would not let us stop to bury the bodies. He says the snow is coming, but there is no snow in the sky. Only fire. I turned the page, skipping days, reading fragments of a descent into madness. The entries spoke of water running out, of oxen dying and being butchered for meat that was too tough to chew. But then, near the end of the book, the tone changed. The fear wasn't about the elements anymore. It was about the direction. November 2nd, the script became erratic, pressed hard into the paper. Holloway is lying. I saw his map last night by the fire. This is not the cutoff. This is not the way to California. He is leading us somewhere else. He speaks of a valley where the walls are made of gold, but his eyes are dark when he says it. We are not travelers to him. We are cargo. I fear we are not meant to arrive. I looked up from the book, the wind suddenly feeling colder on my face. This changed everything. The history books tell us these people were pioneers, brave souls seeking land and opportunity. They don't talk about the ones who were led astray on purpose. They don't talk about the guides who were predators in human skin. I turned to the final entry. It was undated, written in a script so faint I had to squint against the glare of the sun to read it. He has taken the lead wagon ahead. He told us to wait, but he cut the ropes. I heard them snap. We are trapped on the ledge. If anyone finds this, do not follow the smoke. The smoke is a trap. The valley below is not salvation. It is a cage. I closed the book, my breath catching in my throat. The wreckage around me suddenly felt different. It wasn't an accident. It was a barricade, a deliberate obstruction to stop anyone from following or fleeing. The traveler I was tracking, the one who made these ruts, wasn't just lost. He was being hunted. Or perhaps he was being herded. I stood up, shoving the tin into my pack. The view from Dead Man's Pass stretched out before me, a panorama of jagged peaks and deep, shadow-filled valleys. But now the beauty was gone. The landscape looked sinister. I looked down at the trail ahead, the faint ruts continuing past the wreckage, leading down the other side of the pass into a bowl-shaped depression that was swallowed by shadow. The journal said the valley was a cage. It said the guide had lied, but the tracks continued. Someone had survived this wreck. Someone had kept walking, driven by a fear greater than the mountain itself. I tightened the straps of my pack. I had to know. I had to see what Holloway had promised them and what he had actually delivered. The wind howled through the ribs of the broken wagon, sounding like a chorus of warnings, but I stepped over the tongue and began the descent. The tracks were leading me to a place that shouldn't exist on any map, but what I found in the next valley changed everything.
The journal in my pack felt heavier than lead, a paperweight of betrayal pressing against my spine. But as I descended from the pass, I realized that the treacherous guide named Holloway wasn't the only enemy waiting in these mountains. The land itself seemed to wake up, offended that I had uncovered its dirty secret. In the high desert, the weather doesn't change, it explodes. One minute, the sky was a piercing, innocent blue. The next, the air pressure dropped so fast my ears popped, a physical sensation like a door slamming shut on the world. The silence that had followed me for days was suddenly replaced by a low, vibrating hum, the sound of millions of tons of air colliding with the peaks above. I looked to the west and my stomach turned over. A wall of darkness was consuming the horizon. It wasn't rain, it was earth. A massive haboob, a rolling tsunami of dust and grit was tearing across the valley floor, rising thousands of feet into the air. It moved with a terrifying, sentient purpose, erasing the mountains, the sky, and the light. My first instinct was survival. I needed cover. But my second instinct was panic, not for my life, but for the tracks. I looked down at the faint parallel depressions in the soil. They were so fragile. 200 years of wind and rain had already reduced them to mere suggestions of a road. A storm of this magnitude wouldn't just hide them, it would scrub them from existence.
It would fill the ruts with fresh drift, smoothing the scarred face of the desert until it looked as if no human being had ever set foot here. The history I was following was about to be deleted. The wind hit me before the dust did. It didn't blow, it punched. It nearly knocked me off my feet, tearing at my pack straps and stinging my exposed skin with flying gravel. The temperature plummeted 20 degrees in seconds. I scrambled down a slope of loose shale, looking for an overhang, a cave, anything. Then the world turned brown. Visibility dropped to the length of my arm. The sky was blotted out, replaced by a suffocating twilight. The sound was deafening, a constant roaring scream that drowned out my own thoughts. I pulled my scarf up over my face and narrowed my eyes to slits, but the dust found its way in. It tasted of copper and old bones. It coated my teeth and filled my lungs, a dry, choking reminder that out here, biology is weak and geology is forever. I found a shallow depression beneath a shelf of sandstone and curled into a ball, pulling my knees to my chest. My expensive, modern gear, the windbreaker, the synthetic fibers, felt laughably inadequate. I thought of the families in the wagons. They didn't have nylon, they had canvas that ripped and wool that stayed wet for days. When a storm like this hit the train, they couldn't hide in a cave. They had to huddle inside their shaking wagons, listening to the canvas tear, praying the wheels wouldn't shatter under the strain of the wind. I closed my eyes, but the dark was just as loud. In the sensory deprivation of the storm, my mind began to drift back to the journal. The valley below is not salvation. It is a cage. Nature was locking the cage door. It felt personal. It felt as if the storm had been summoned to stop me from seeing what lay at the bottom of the descent. Minutes stretched into hours. Time loses its meaning when you are being sandblasted by a mountain. I drifted into a semi-conscious state, a hypothermic fugue where the boundaries between myself and the pioneers dissolved completely. I wasn't just reading about them anymore, I was suffering with them. I felt the dry crack of their skin, the sting of the sand in their eyes, the hollow ache of thirst that no amount of water could quench. I wondered if Holloway used storms like this. Did he use the chaos of the weather to separate the wagons, to confuse them, to drive them further off the map while they were blinded by the dust? A storm is the perfect accomplice for a liar. It removes all landmarks. It destroys all sense of direction. When the dust clears, you have to trust the man with the compass, even if he's leading you to hell. Eventually, the roar began to subside. The wind lost its violent edge, dropping to a sullen moan. The air was still thick with suspended particulate, hanging like a heavy fog, but the violence had passed. I pushed myself up, shaking a layer of red dust from my shoulders. I felt stiff, aged, as if I had been buried there for a century. I crawled out from the overhang and looked down at the ground. My heart sank. The trail was gone. The storm had done its work. The valley floor was now a smooth, pristine sheet of wind-sculpted sand. The ruts, the scars, the evidence of the struggle, all of it had been wiped clean. I stood there, turning in a slow circle, panic rising in my throat. Without the tracks, I was just a man lost in the wilderness. Without the tracks, the story ended here. I dropped to my knees, frantically brushing away the top layer of fresh sand with my hands, digging like a madman, looking for the compacted earth of the wagon wheels. Nothing. Just more loose dust. I moved 5 feet to the left, dug again. Nothing. I stood up, breathing hard, the taste of failure bitter in my mouth. I had lost them. The desert had reclaimed its secrets. But then the dust cloud shifted slightly, revealing a jagged formation of black rock about 50 yards ahead. It stood out against the red sand, sharp and unnatural. I walked towards it, my boots sinking into the soft drift. As I got closer, I realized it wasn't a rock formation. It was a marker. It was a pile of stones, stacked intentionally in a pyramid shape, a cairn. But it wasn't a navigational marker. It was too crude, too hasty.
I reached it and brushed the dust off the topmost stone. It was scratched with markings. Not words, but symbols. An arrow pointing straight down into the darkest part of the valley, and beneath the arrow, a crude scratching that looked like a skull, or perhaps a warning. The storm had erased the road, but it hadn't erased the destination. The tracks were gone, but the breadcrumbs remained. Someone had anticipated the wind. Someone had wanted to make sure that even if the earth forgot, the direction would remain. I looked in the direction of the arrow. The storm clouds were parting, revealing a valley that looked lush, green, and terrifyingly silent. It was the place Holloway had promised, the Golden Valley. But looking at it now, framed by the retreating storm and the ominous cairn, it didn't look like paradise. It looked like the mouth of a pitcher plant waiting for the fly. I adjusted my pack, the dust grinding in my joints. I didn't need the tracks anymore. The trap was open. All I had to do was walk into it. The tracks were leading me to a place that shouldn't exist on any map, but what I found in the next valley changed everything. The stone arrow was a silent command, pointing me away from the safety of the known world and into a hollow that seemed to hold its breath, waiting for a witness that was never supposed to arrive. I walked down into the valley, the red dust of the storm slowly giving way to a strange, pale grass that crunched dryly under my boots. The transition was jarring. One moment I was in the high desert, battling the elements. The next, I was in a bowl of silence, shielded by high canyon walls that cut off the wind completely. The air here was stagnant, heavy with the scent of pine pitch and something sweeter, something like rotting fruit. My GPS was still dead, a black mirror reflecting the sky. I didn't bother checking it anymore. I knew with a sinking certainty that I had walked off the edge of the modern world. Then I saw the roof lines. They emerged from the shadows of the canyon wall like a mirage, sharp, angular shapes that didn't belong in nature. My first thought was a mining camp, perhaps, a leftover relic from the silver boom of the 1870s. But as I drew closer, the architecture made no sense. Mining camps are chaotic, temporary, built for utility and greed. This was different. This was orderly. It was a town, a full settlement. I stopped at the edge of what used to be a main street. The silence was absolute. No birds sang, no insects buzzed. The only sound was the blood rushing in my ears. I counted 12 structures arranged in a perfect semicircle facing a large central building that looked like a church without a steeple. The wood was weathered to a silver gray, polished by a century of wind, but the buildings were standing. They hadn't collapsed. They stood tall and rigid, like sentinels guarding a secret that died with them. I checked my map again just to be sure. I knew every ghost town in Nevada and Utah. I knew Bodie, I knew Rhyolite, I knew the obscurities that only treasure hunters whisper about. But this place wasn't on any database. It wasn't on the satellite imagery. It was tucked so deep into the fold of the mountain, shadowed so heavily by the overhangs, that from the air it would look like nothing more than a pile of rocks. I stepped onto the main street. The ground was hard packed, not by tires, but by boots and hooves. I walked past the first house. The door was shut tight. The windows were dark, staring back at me like hollow eyes. I felt a profound sense of intrusion. Usually in ghost towns, you feel like a tourist. Here, I felt like a trespasser. I felt like I was walking into a room where an argument had just ended. I approached the window of the third house and cupped my hands against the glass, wiping away a layer of grime. My breath hitched. It wasn't empty. Inside, I saw a table set for dinner. Pewter plates covered in a thick layer of dust. A chair knocked over on its side. A child's doll made of corn husks and fabric lying face down on the floorboards. It didn't look like a place that had been abandoned over years. It looked like a place that had been fled in minutes. I moved deeper into the settlement. The layout was unsettling. In a normal frontier town, the buildings faced the road, welcoming trade and travelers.
Here, the houses were angled slightly inward, creating a sense of surveillance. They were built to watch each other. The community wasn't designed for openness, it was designed for control. I reached the center of the semicircle, standing before the large steepleless church. Above the double doors, carved into a heavy beam of oak, was the name of the settlement. It wasn't painted, it was burned into the wood. Providence. The irony of the name tasted bitter on my tongue. Providence. God's will. I pushed on the heavy doors. They groaned, the rusted hinges screaming into the silence, a sound so loud it made me flinch. I stepped inside. The air in the building was cooler, smelling of old paper and dry rot. Sunlight filtered through the cracks in the roof, illuminating swirling motes of dust that danced in the gloom. Rows of rough-hewn benches faced a simple wooden pulpit, but it was what was behind the pulpit that froze me. It wasn't a cross. It was a map. It was a massive hand-drawn map painted directly onto the plaster of the back wall. It depicted the mountains, the desert, the trail I had followed, but the lines were different. The path didn't lead to California. It didn't lead to Oregon. All the lines, all the cutoffs and secret trails spiraled inward, leading to this exact valley. I walked up the aisle, my footsteps echoing on the floorboards. I traced the lines with my flashlight. This wasn't a map of salvation. It was a spider web. Holloway, or whoever had built this place, hadn't just led one wagon train astray. He had been harvesting them. He had been diverting the desperate, the lost, and the gullible into this box canyon, building his own private kingdom away from the eyes of the law. I found a ledger sitting on the pulpit. It was thick, bound in cracked leather, similar to the journal I had found in the wreck. I opened it. It wasn't a Bible. It was a census. October 1846, the Miller Party. Arrived 22 souls, converted 18, discarded 4. June 1847, the O'Connor family. Arrived 7 souls, converted 7. Converted, the word sent a chill down my spine. Converted to what? I left the building, stumbling back out into the harsh sunlight. The town suddenly looked different. It wasn't a sanctuary. It was a prison camp disguised as a paradise. The high canyon walls weren't there to keep the wind out. They were there to keep the people in. I walked to the far end of the town, where the semicircle of houses ended. There was a path leading up a small rise to a solitary house that sat higher than the others. It was larger, with a porch that overlooked the entire settlement. The governor's house, the warden's house, Holloway's house. I climbed the path, my hand resting on the knife in my belt, though I knew the ghosts couldn't be hurt by steel. The front door of this large house was wide open, swinging gently in the draft. I stepped onto the porch and turned to look out over the town. From up here, the layout was even more obvious. The houses were arranged like sheep in a pen, and I was standing in the position of the shepherd. But something was wrong. If this was a successful settlement, where were the graves? A town this size existing for years would have a cemetery. People die, children get sick, accidents happen. But I had seen no headstones, no crosses on the hillside. I walked into the main room of the large house. It was chaotic. Drawers were pulled out, papers scattered on the floor. It looked like the end of a regime. Someone had left in a hurry, taking only what they could carry. On a heavy oak desk in the corner, I found a tin-type photograph. It was small, encased in a brass frame. It showed a man with intense pale eyes and a long beard, standing in front of this very house. He had a hand resting on the shoulder of a young girl who looked terrified. I turned the photograph over. On the back, in elegant, flowing script, it read, Father Holloway, 1848, the Shepherd of the Lost. I shoved the photo into my pocket. The silence of the town began to feel hostile. I felt like I was being observed, not by the living, but by the tragedy that soaked into the wood and stone. I went out the back door of the house, looking for the water source, looking for the reason they had chosen this spot.
That's when I found the answer to the missing graves. Behind the house, stretching out into a narrow ravine that cut deeper into the mountain, were rows of mounds. They weren't marked with names. They were marked with numbers. Hundreds of them. This wasn't just a settlement. It was a coal camp. I stood there staring at the field of anonymous dead, realizing the magnitude of the horror. These people hadn't died of thirst in the desert. They hadn't died of exposure on the pass. They had survived the journey, survived the heartbreak, only to walk willingly into a trap laid by a man who promised them heaven and gave them a shallow grave. But the tracks, the wagon tracks I had followed, they didn't end in the town. I looked past the graveyard, further up the ravine. There, cutting through the brush, faint but unmistakable, was a single set of wagon ruts. One wagon. One vehicle had not stopped. One vehicle had driven through the settlement, past the church, past the governor's house, and straight out the back, heading for the only exit, a narrow, treacherous climb up the far canyon wall. It was the last wagon, the one that got away, the one that knew the truth. I adjusted my pack, turning my back on the town of Providence. The story wasn't over. The villain had been revealed, but the hero, the one who escaped, was still out there. I had to know who they were. I had to know if they made it. The tracks were leading me to a place that shouldn't exist on any map. But what I found in the next valley changed everything. Turning my back on the silent horror of Providence, I followed the single, desperate line of ruts that clawed their way up the canyon wall, a scar of defiance against a landscape of surrender. The town below was a monument to control, but this trail, this erratic, jagged path cut into the limestone, was a monument to the terrifying chaos of escape. The ascent was brutal. It wasn't a road, it was a vertical struggle. I could read the panic in the geology. I saw deep, frantic gouges in the rock where the iron rims had slipped and sparked. I saw the places where the wagon had nearly tipped over, sliding perilously close to the edge, only to be righted by what must have been hysterical, superhuman strength. This wasn't a journey of exploration, it was a sprint against execution. I climbed for 2 hours, my lungs burning, the air growing colder and cooler. The sun began to dip behind the peaks, casting long, distorted shadows that looked like grasping hands reaching up from the valley floor. The tracks led me to a high, secluded alcove, a natural cul-de-sac of stone, hidden from the town below, but offering a perfect eagle-eye view of the trap they had fled. And there it was, the last wagon. It sat in the center of the alcove, preserved by the dry, high-altitude air and the overhang of the cliff. It wasn't wrecked like the one at Dead Man's Pass. It was parked. The brake lever was pulled back and locked with a rusted chain. The wheels were chalked with large stones. It stood defiant, a wooden fortress that had reached the end of its line. The canvas cover had largely rotted away, leaving the wooden ribs exposed like the rib cage of a whale. But the body of the wagon was intact. The wood was gray and furrowed, bullet-scarred. I ran my fingers over the holes. Lead balls, fired from below. Holloway hadn't just let them leave, he had hunted them. They had taken fire as they climbed, a slow-moving target on a sheer cliff face. I walked around to the back of the wagon. The silence here was different than in the town. It wasn't the silence of oppression, it was the silence of a vigil. I felt a heavy lump form in my throat. I didn't want to look inside. I didn't want to disturb the peace of whoever drove this thing to the roof of the world, but I had to know. I pulled myself up onto the tailgate. The wood creaked, a mournful sound that echoed off the canyon walls. I shone my flashlight into the gloom of the wagon bed. There were 3 of them. They were skeletons now, still clad in the tattered remains of wool and leather. 2 adults in the front, huddled together against the buckboard, and one smaller figure in the back, curled up on a bed of blankets. The woman, I assumed it was the woman, had her arm draped over the man's shoulders. Even in death, even stripped to bone, the posture was unmistakable. It was comfort. It was love in the face of the inevitable. But they hadn't died of bullets. The siege had been long.
I saw the empty water barrels. I saw the scrape marks on the floorboards where they had likely tried to lick the last moisture from the wood. They had been trapped here, pinned down by Holloway's men below, unable to go back, unable to go forward. They had chosen to starve rather than return to Providence. But why? Why flee with such desperation only to corner themselves? Then I saw it. Between the two adults, resting on the floorboards like a holy relic, was a heavy iron strongbox. It was padlocked, but the wood around the hasp had rotted. I pulled, and the lock came free with a dull clank. I expected a journal. I expected a map. I expected proof of Holloway's crimes. I lifted the lid. Gold. Dull, heavy, glinting nuggets and dust filling the box to the brim. It was a fortune. In 1847, this box could have bought a city. It could have bought passage to anywhere on Earth. It was the stuff of dreams, the very thing that drove the migration west. I sat back, confused. Had they stolen it? Was this a getaway gone wrong? Was the Last Wagon just a getaway car for a thief who got greedy? Then I saw the note. It was folded and tucked into the gold dust, preserved by the lack of oxygen inside the box. I unfolded the brittle paper with trembling fingers. The ink was faded, brown with age, but legible. To whoever finds this, the letter began. We did not take this for ourselves. This gold is the blood of the Miller party. It is the blood of the O'Connors. It is the tithe Holloway demanded for safe passage to his paradise. He needs this to buy the silence of the scouts. He needs this to bring more sheep to the slaughter. I read on, my heart pounding. He told us God demanded it. We gave it, but when we saw the graves, when we saw what he did to the ones who questioned him, we knew he is not a prophet. He is a monster fed by avarice. We could not kill him, but we could starve him. We have taken his power. Without this box, his kingdom will crumble. The scouts will not work for prayers. They want gold. We are taking it where he cannot reach it. I looked at the skeletons with new eyes. They weren't thieves. They were martyrs. They hadn't run to save their lives. They had run to kill the town. They knew they wouldn't make it out. The wagon was too heavy, the terrain too rough. They had chosen to starve rather than return to Providence. But why? Why flee with such desperation only to corner themselves? Then I saw what Holloway had miscalculated, his fatal mistake. He underestimated their courage. I reached into the box and picked up a nugget. It was cold, heavy, and useless. It was the most expensive tombstone in the world. I placed the note back in the box and closed the lid. I wouldn't take it. I wouldn't touch it. It belonged to them. It was their victory. But as I climbed out of the wagon, ready to leave this sacred place, I noticed something else. Tucked behind the driver's seat, hidden in the shadows, was a second, smaller leather pouch. It wasn't gold. It was a canvas satchel, the kind used to carry mail. I opened it. Inside wasn't money. It was letters, dozens of them. Letters written by the people in the mass graves. Letters that Holloway had promised to send back east to their families, but had hoarded instead. Dear Mother, we are safe. Dearest brother, we have found Zion. These were the lies Holloway forced them to write before he killed them. But at the bottom of the sack was a map, a real map, one drawn by the father of this family. It showed a way out, not back the way I came, but forward, a narrow goat path leading up the cliff face, behind the alcove, towards the high plateau in the true west. I shouldered my pack. The gold stayed with the dead, but the truth was coming with me. The tracks were leading me to a place that shouldn't exist on any map, but what I found in the next valley changed everything. I left the gold where it lay, a cold and heavy shrine to a courage I can barely comprehend. But as I turned to find the goat path out of the alcove, I realized I was carrying something far heavier than metal. The canvas satchel of letters slung over my shoulder weighed next to nothing, yet it contained the stolen goodbyes of 100 souls. It was a burden of truth that had waited a century and a half to be carried down the mountain. The climb out was a blur of adrenaline and exhaustion. I followed the faint, treacherous goat path etched onto the map by the father who had died guarding the box. It led me up, away from the shadows of Providence, away from the tragic silence of the Last Wagon, and onto the high, windswept table of the plateau. When I finally crested the ridge, the sun was beginning to bleed into the western horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of bruised purple and burning orange. And there, in the distance, I saw it, a thin, glittering ribbon cutting through the chaos of the desert, the interstate. It was miles away, but I could see the tiny rhythmic flash of semi-trucks reflecting the sunlight. I could hear the faint, low-frequency hum of tires on asphalt, the heartbeat of the modern world. It should have been a comforting sight. It should have meant safety, water, air conditioning, and a signal for my phone. But instead, it stopped me cold. I stood there on the edge of the wilderness, looking at that highway, and I felt a profound, aching disconnect. Down there, cars were rushing at 75 miles an hour, filled with people worrying about emails, mortgage rates, and what to eat for dinner. They were gliding over the landscape, insulated from it by steel and glass and climate control. They didn't know. They didn't know that just a few miles into the jagged dark, there was a valley where time had stopped. They didn't know about the wagon rotting on the ledge, or the gold that would never be spent, or the town built on lies. I began the long walk back to my truck. My boots, now scuffed and gray with the dust of the 1840s, felt strange hitting the flat ground. The transition was jarring. As I walked, the silence of the mountains began to retreat, replaced by the noise of the present. The wind no longer whispered, it just blew. The shadows stopped looking like ghosts and went back to being shadows. The spell of the trail was breaking, but it left a residue on my soul that I knew would never wash off. When I finally reached my truck, parked exactly where I had left it days ago, it looked like a spaceship. It was a relic of a future that the people in Providence couldn't have even engaged in their wildest fever dreams. I unlocked the door, and the interior light flickered on, a harsh, artificial dome of safety. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time, just gripping the steering wheel, staring out at the darkening sagebrush. I didn't turn the key. I didn't want to break the silence just yet. I pulled the satchel of letters onto my lap. I ran my thumb over the coarse canvas. Why do we do it? Why do we retrace these steps? Why do we obsess over old ruts in the dirt? In the modern world, we are obsessed with the new. We worship progress. We believe that if we can just move fast enough, if we can just build high enough, we can outrun our mortality. We pave over the rough spots. We tunnel through the mountains so we don't have to climb them. We have sanitized the journey. But the wagon tracks, they tell a different story. They remind us that the earth is hard and life is fragile. I thought about the family in the last wagon. I thought about the mother holding her child in the dark, knowing the end was coming, yet choosing to write a letter of hope. I thought about the father who chose to starve rather than let a tyrant win. That is not just history. That is the raw, unpolished architecture of the human spirit. We follow these tracks not because we want to live in the past, but because we need to remember what we are made of. We are the descendants of survivors. Whether our ancestors came on the Mayflower or a slave ship or a jet plane or a wagon train, somewhere down the line, someone walked through a valley of shadow so that we could stand in the light. Someone endured the impossible so that we could have the luxury of being bored on a highway. I started the engine. The radio flared to life, a burst of static and a pop song that sounded tinny and trivial. I turned it off. I guided the truck back onto the gravel road, the tires crunching loudly. As I drove back toward civilization, watching the headlights cut a cone of visibility into the night, I realized that the lost trail wasn't lost at all. It was hiding. It was waiting for someone to care enough to look. The desert is a vault. It keeps everything we give it. It keeps the bones, the gold, the lies, and the truths. It holds them in trust, waiting for a witness. I looked in the rearview mirror one last time. The mountains were just a black silhouette now against the stars. The valley of Providence, the wreckage at Dead Man's Pass, the ghost of Holloway, they were all behind me, swallowed by the night. But they weren't gone. I touched the satchel on the seat beside me. I had work to do. There were historical societies to contact. There were descendants to find. There were letters to deliver. Letters that were 170 years late, but perhaps right on time. The tracks on the ground will eventually fade. The wind will erode the ruts until the desert floor is smooth again. The sagebrush will grow over the path, and the rain will wash away the scars of the wheels. That is the way of nature. It heals, it forgets. But we cannot afford to forget. If you ever find yourself out west on a stretch of highway where the radio signal dies and the horizon stretches out forever, do me a favor. Pull over, turn off the engine, step out onto the dirt. Don't look at your phone, look at the ground. Look for the faint parallel depressions that don't quite match the drainage of the rain. Look for the scars. And if you find them, don't just walk over them. Stand in them. Close your eyes. Listen to the wind. Because if you listen closely enough, beneath the noise of your own life, you might hear a creak of a wheel, a snap of a whip, and a whisper of a promise kept. The tracks don't lead to a destination anymore. They lead to us. They are the tether that binds us to the people who broke the trail. We are the legacy, and as long as we remember them, the wagon never truly stops moving. I put the truck in gear and merged onto the pavement, joining the stream of red taillights flowing into the future. But I drove a little slower this time. I watched the dark shoulders of the road. I knew that just beyond the asphalt, the ghosts were still walking, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't running from them. I was riding with them. The tracks led me to a place that shouldn't exist on any map, and what I found was myself.